Long before satellites stitched the planet together with invisible signals, and long before data centers began storing humanity's memory in quiet server halls, the most powerful arteries of global power lay hidden beneath the ocean. They were not pipelines, and they were not shipping routes. They were cables, thin, armored veins stretching across the seabed, carrying electricity and information between continents. At first glance, they appeared to be nothing more than engineering projects, but over time they became something far more significant. They transformed the strategic balance between nations, quietly shifting influence in ways that few outside specialized circles fully understood. This story begins in the 19th century, when the first undersea cables were imagined not as power systems, but as communication lifelines. The industrial world was expanding rapidly. Empires stretched across oceans, and the need to communicate across vast distances became urgent. Messages sent by ship could take weeks or months. Trade decisions, military commands, and political negotiations moved slowly because information moved slowly. The solution seemed almost impossible: run a wire across the ocean floor. Early engineers faced enormous skepticism. The seabed was mysterious and poorly mapped. Storms, pressure, and corrosion threatened to destroy any fragile cable placed there. Yet inventors and financiers believed the rewards would be enormous. When the first successful transatlantic telegraph cable connected Europe and North America in the 1850s, the world changed overnight. Messages that once required weeks could travel in minutes. Governments could coordinate across oceans. Markets reacted instantly to information from other continents. But what began as communication technology soon revealed another truth: whoever controlled the cables controlled the flow of global information. Empires quickly understood the implications. The British Empire, which dominated global trade routes during the 19th century, began constructing a vast network of submarine cables linking its territories. These cables connected London to India, Africa, Australia, and Canada. The system became known informally as the All-Red Line, referencing the red color used to mark British territories on maps. This network allowed Britain to communicate securely across its empire without relying on cables that passed through rival nations. In an era when telegraph messages carried military intelligence and financial information, the strategic advantage was enormous. Other nations noticed. France, Germany, and the United States began building their own cable systems. By the late 19th century, the oceans were slowly filling with a hidden web of wires that paralleled the shipping lanes above. But the cables were fragile. Anchors could damage them. Undersea landslides could bury them. Sabotage was also possible. During times of peace, these risks seemed manageable. During war, they became critical vulnerabilities. When the First World War erupted in 1914, one of Britain's first actions was to cut Germany's transatlantic telegraph cables. British naval vessels located the cables in the English Channel and severed them, forcing Germany to rely on radio transmissions that could be intercepted. The act demonstrated something profound. Submarine cables were strategic weapons. For decades afterward, nations quietly invested in undersea infrastructure. At first, the focus remained on communication cables, but as electrical technology improved, engineers began imagining a new possibility: transmitting power across oceans. This idea sounded even more improbable than the telegraph cables had once seemed. Electricity loses energy as it travels through wires, and long underwater distances posed enormous technical challenges. Saltwater environments accelerated corrosion. Insulation materials had to withstand immense pressure. Still, research continued. By the mid-20th century, advances in high-voltage direct current transmission, known as HVDC, began making long-distance underwater power transmission feasible. HVDC allowed electricity to travel farther with fewer losses than traditional alternating current systems. The technology opened the door to something revolutionary. Continents could be connected not just by communication cables, but by energy. At first, the concept was applied on a small scale. Countries separated by narrow seas experimented with submarine power links. These projects allowed electricity to flow between national grids, helping balance supply and demand. One of the earliest major examples appeared in Europe, where power cables began linking Scandinavian hydroelectric systems with continental electricity networks. Norway and Sweden possessed enormous renewable energy resources, while countries like Germany and the Netherlands had large industrial demands. Submarine cables allowed surplus power in one region to support shortages in another. What began as economic cooperation gradually revealed deeper geopolitical implications. Energy is power in the most literal sense. Nations depend on reliable electricity for industry, defense systems, communications networks, and daily life. If power supply can be influenced, then national stability can be influenced as well. The undersea cables created new forms of interdependence. Countries connected by energy cables gained resilience, but also vulnerability. A cable failure could trigger shortages across borders. Control over transmission routes could become leverage in negotiations. During the Cold War, strategic planners studied these dynamics carefully. While nuclear weapons dominated headlines, infrastructure quietly shaped the real structure of influence. Undersea cables became part of that structure. Some carried communication signals between continents, supporting early global internet networks. Others carried electricity between nations, forming the beginnings of what engineers called the undersea grid. These systems were mostly invisible to the public. Their routes appeared only on technical maps. Ships passed above them without noticing them. But governments and energy companies understood their growing significance. By the late 20th century, the technology had matured dramatically. Advances in insulation materials, cable-laying ships, and seabed mapping allowed engineers to deploy cables thousands of kilometers long. At the same time, the global energy landscape was changing. Renewable energy sources like offshore wind farms began appearing in coastal waters. These installations generated electricity far from land, requiring underwater cables to bring power ashore. As offshore wind capacity expanded, networks of submarine cables multiplied across the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, and other coastal regions. Suddenly, the seabed was no longer empty. It was becoming crowded with infrastructure. Energy cables crossed communication cables. Pipelines shared corridors with fiber optic lines. The ocean floor began resembling a hidden version of the world's transportation networks. This complexity created new strategic considerations. Governments realized that the cables connecting their power grids were both lifelines and potential pressure points. A damaged cable could isolate energy markets. A disrupted connection could create economic shock waves. Military planners began studying how undersea infrastructure might be protected or targeted in future conflicts. At the same time, another transformation was underway. The global internet relied increasingly on submarine fiber optic cables. These cables carried nearly all international data traffic. Financial transactions, cloud computing, video streaming, and government communications flowed through them. In many cases, power cables and communication cables shared similar routes or installation technologies.
The same specialized ships laid them. The same seabed surveys guided their placement. Together, they formed an invisible backbone of globalization. By the early 21st century, the world had entered a new phase of technological dependence. Energy networks, data networks, and communication systems were intertwined beneath the oceans. This was the beginning of what analysts would later call the undersea grid. Unlike traditional power grids confined within national borders, this system spanned continents. Electricity flowed between countries through submarine HVDC cables. Markets became interconnected. Grid operators coordinated power transfers across thousands of kilometers. The system improved efficiency and supported renewable energy expansion, but
The world's oceans have always appeared vast and empty when viewed from the surface. Ships cross them, storms churn them, and satellites photograph their endless blue. But beneath those waters lies a different reality, one shaped not by waves, but by steel, insulation, and silent currents of electricity. By the middle of the 20th century, engineers had already proven that submarine communication cables could span oceans. Messages moved through copper wires and later through fiber optics. But transmitting electricity across long underwater distances required a completely different technological breakthrough. Traditional power grids relied on alternating current. AC systems worked well on land because transformers could easily increase or decrease voltage levels. But underwater cables presented a different challenge. Long AC cables generated large electrical losses due to capacitance, and those losses increased dramatically with distance. For decades, this problem made long submarine power cables impractical. The solution emerged through the development of high-voltage direct current transmission. Instead of sending electricity in alternating waves, HVDC systems converted it into a steady flow of current. That simple change dramatically reduced losses over long distances. But the technology required complex converter stations capable of transforming alternating current from national grids into direct current for transmission, and then converting it back again at the receiving end. These stations were expensive and technically demanding, yet they opened the door to something that had previously been impossible: moving massive quantities of electricity across seas and between continents. One of the earliest major demonstrations came in 1954 when a submarine HVDC link connected the Swedish mainland with the island of Gotland. It was not a long cable by modern standards, but it proved that the concept worked. Engineers across the world began to pay attention. Energy planners soon realized that submarine cables could solve problems that had plagued national electricity systems for decades. Countries often produced electricity unevenly across regions. Hydropower might be abundant in mountains, while industrial demand concentrated near cities. Wind power fluctuated with weather patterns. Seasonal changes created unpredictable surges or shortages. Submarine cables could connect these mismatched systems. Instead of each country building excess power plants to cover peak demand, interconnected grids could share electricity across borders. When one region generated surplus energy, it could export power to another experiencing a shortage. This concept transformed how engineers and policymakers thought about energy. Electricity was no longer confined within national boundaries. It could become part of an international network. Northern Europe quickly became a laboratory for these experiments. Scandinavian countries possessed enormous hydropower resources thanks to their rivers and mountainous terrain. Their power plants often generated more electricity than domestic markets required.
Meanwhile, continental Europe, particularly Germany and the Netherlands, needed additional power to support industry and growing populations. Submarine HVDC cables offered a bridge between these systems. As the technology matured through the 1960s and 1970s, engineers began laying longer cables beneath seas, such as the Baltic and the North Sea. Each project extended the reach of the emerging undersea grid. What began as regional cooperation slowly grew into something much larger. These connections allowed electricity markets to evolve beyond national control. Utilities could buy and sell power across borders. Prices began to reflect regional supply and demand rather than strictly local conditions. This integration improved efficiency, but it also shifted economic influence. Countries capable of exporting reliable electricity gained leverage in energy markets. Nations dependent on imports became sensitive to price changes and supply disruptions. In other words, submarine power cables created not only engineering networks, but political relationships. By the late 20th century, the idea of an interconnected European grid gained momentum. Governments recognized that cooperation could strengthen energy security while supporting economic growth. Yet even during these optimistic years, strategic thinkers remained cautious. Energy dependence has always shaped geopolitics. The oil shocks of the 1970s demonstrated how vulnerable modern economies could become when critical resources were controlled by external suppliers. Submarine cables raised similar questions. What would happen if a major power link failed? Could a country be pressured through control of electricity flows? Would interdependence strengthen alliances or create new vulnerabilities? These questions remained largely theoretical for decades because the cables were few and their capacities relatively limited. But technology never stands still. By the 1990s, the electrical engineering industry had achieved remarkable advances in cable materials. New forms of polymer insulation allowed cables to operate at higher voltages. Manufacturing techniques improved reliability and reduced failure rates. Meanwhile, specialized cable-laying vessels grew larger and more sophisticated. These ships could carry thousands of tons of cable, coiled in enormous circular tanks. Precision navigation systems allowed them to lay cables along carefully surveyed routes across the seabed. At the same time, ocean mapping technology improved dramatically. Sonar and satellite positioning systems revealed underwater terrain in unprecedented detail. Engineers could avoid unstable slopes, volcanic ridges, or areas prone to landslides. These innovations made longer and deeper submarine cables feasible. As the 20th century came to a close, something remarkable began to happen. The number of undersea power projects increased rapidly. Nations saw opportunities to strengthen their grids, integrate renewable energy, and stabilize electricity markets. And with each new project, the invisible web beneath the oceans grew more complex. In Europe, the North Sea gradually became one of the densest regions of undersea energy infrastructure in the world. Countries bordering the sea, including Norway, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, began linking their grids through HVDC cables. These connections allowed electricity generated in one country to flow into another within seconds. If strong winds drove offshore turbines along the British coast, surplus electricity could be exported to mainland Europe. If hydropower reservoirs in Norway produced excess energy during heavy rainfall, that power could travel south to industrial regions. In theory, the system made everyone stronger. But infrastructure shapes influence in subtler ways. The location of cable landing points became economically significant. Converter stations, massive facilities that manage the conversion between AC and DC electricity, required billions of dollars in investment. Regions hosting these stations became critical nodes within the grid. Energy traders, utilities, and governments began paying attention to where cables connected. Control over these nodes meant control over how electricity moved through the network. Meanwhile, similar developments were occurring beyond Europe. In East Asia, rapidly growing economies required enormous amounts of electricity. Some countries explored submarine cables as a way to link isolated energy systems. Island nations especially recognized the benefits of interconnection. Japan, for example, built submarine power links between its islands to strengthen grid stability. In Southeast Asia, discussions emerged about connecting national grids through submarine cables to create a regional power market. In the Middle East and North Africa, energy planners considered long submarine connections across the Mediterranean. Some projects envisioned exporting solar energy from North Africa into Europe through HVDC lines beneath the sea. Each proposal represented more than a technical achievement. It represented a new relationship between nations. The cables created pathways through which energy and influence could travel. At the same time, another revolution was occurring alongside the expansion of submarine power networks. The digital age was exploding. Fiber optic communication cables began replacing older copper telegraph lines. These cables used pulses of light to
By the early years of the 21st century, the expansion of submarine energy cables was no longer just a technical story. It had quietly evolved into a strategic contest between regions seeking to shape the future of global power distribution. The oceans, once viewed as barriers between energy systems, were gradually turning into corridors of connection, and wherever connections appeared, influence followed. Energy has always been central to geopolitical power. Coal powered the industrial empires of the 19th century. Oil shaped the alliances and conflicts of the 20th. But electricity, especially electricity moving across international grids, was becoming the defining energy system of the 21st century. Unlike oil tankers or gas pipelines, electricity travels almost instantly. Power can surge across borders in seconds. Markets react in real time. A surplus in one region can stabilize shortages in another, thousands of kilometers away. Submarine HVDC cables made this possible across seas and oceans. And because the cables could move enormous amounts of electricity, the countries connected to them began to see their position in the network as strategically important. Nowhere was this clearer than in Europe. The North Sea had slowly transformed into a massive energy basin. Offshore wind farms were multiplying along the coasts of the United Kingdom, Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Norway's vast hydropower reservoirs offered a natural battery capable of balancing fluctuations in wind generation. To connect these resources, engineers began constructing long HVDC interconnectors beneath the sea. One of the most ambitious projects linked Norway and the Netherlands through a cable stretching more than 500 kilometers across the seabed. The line allowed Norway to export hydropower when European demand surged and import electricity when water levels in its reservoirs fell. Soon after, other interconnectors followed. Britain built cables linking its grid to France, Belgium, and Norway. Denmark strengthened connections with Germany and Sweden. The Netherlands expanded links with the United Kingdom. Each new cable increased the flexibility of the European energy system, but it also created a subtle hierarchy. Countries with strong interconnections gained the ability to influence electricity markets across the region. They could import cheaper power during shortages and export during periods of high prices. Their grids became gateways through which electricity moved between neighboring states. Energy analysts began referring to these nations as grid hubs. A grid hub could shape the flow of electricity much like a major airport controls air travel routes. Even if the hub did not generate all the power itself, its infrastructure allowed it to direct how energy circulated. This concept transformed the strategic importance of geography. Small coastal regions with favorable locations suddenly became valuable landing points for submarine cables. Governments competed to attract infrastructure investment, knowing that each new connection strengthened their role in the network. Meanwhile, offshore wind development accelerated dramatically. The North Sea, in particular, became one of the most concentrated renewable energy zones on Earth. Thousands of turbines rose from the water, their blades sweeping slowly above the waves. Each turbine required submarine cables to carry electricity to offshore substations. From there, larger transmission cables transported the power to land. As the number of wind farms grew, engineers began building shared offshore hubs capable of connecting multiple projects. These hubs gathered electricity and routed it through high-capacity HVDC cables toward different countries. In effect, the sea itself was becoming part of the power grid. And because the grid extended across national borders, energy policy began to intersect with geopolitics in new ways. Governments recognized that interconnection brought advantages, but also dependencies. For example, if a country relied heavily on imported electricity through a submarine cable, that connection could become a point of vulnerability during political disputes or emergencies. Even if the electricity market operated on commercial principles, governments always retained influence over infrastructure within their territories. This meant that control over cable landing stations and converter facilities carried strategic value. The converter stations themselves were massive technological structures. They contained banks of power electronics capable of transforming alternating current from domestic grids into high-voltage direct current for transmission through submarine cables. These stations could cost billions of dollars and required years to construct. Once built, they became critical nodes within the energy network. Protecting them became a national priority. Security agencies began considering scenarios in which these facilities might be targeted by cyber attacks or physical sabotage. While such events were rare, the consequences could be severe if electricity flows between major grids were suddenly interrupted. Meanwhile, outside Europe, other regions were observing these developments closely. Asia, with its enormous and rapidly growing energy demand, began exploring similar interconnection strategies. In Northeast Asia, some energy planners proposed linking the electricity systems of Japan, South Korea, China, and even Russia through submarine HVDC cables. The concept was ambitious, a regional supergrid capable of sharing renewable energy across thousands of kilometers. Supporters argued that such a network could stabilize electricity supply while reducing carbon emissions. For instance, wind farms in Mongolia or solar plants in northern China might export energy to densely populated coastal cities through long-distance HVDC transmission. Yet the idea also raised sensitive political questions. Energy networks create interdependence. For countries with complex historical relationships or strategic rivalries, deep energy dependence could feel risky. Still, the technological possibility remained. Similar discussions appeared in Southeast Asia, where island nations faced challenges integrating their electricity systems. Submarine cables offered a way to connect isolated grids, allowing countries to share power resources. In the Middle East and North Africa, the concept of exporting renewable electricity across the Mediterranean resurfaced repeatedly. Vast solar farms in desert regions could theoretically send power northward into Europe through submarine HVDC cables. If realized, such projects would reshape global energy trade. Instead of transporting fuel, coal, oil, or gas, countries could export electricity directly. But exporting electricity requires infrastructure ownership, and ownership raises strategic questions. Which companies build the cables? Which governments regulate the connections?
Who controls the converter stations that determine when electricity flows? These questions slowly transformed submarine power infrastructure into a geopolitical arena. At the same time, another dimension of undersea infrastructure continued expanding alongside the energy grid: communication cables. The modern internet relies almost entirely on submarine fiber optic lines. These cables carry more than 90% of international data traffic. Every email, financial transaction, streaming video, and cloud server request crossing continents usually travels through them. As technology companies grew into global giants, they began investing directly in submarine cable projects. Firms that operated massive data centers needed faster and more reliable international connections. This corporate investment accelerated the construction of new routes across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. While these fiber optic cables carried data rather than electricity, they often shared corridors with power infrastructure. The same seabed regions became crowded with multiple layers of cables. In certain narrow straits or coastal approaches, dozens of lines might pass within relatively small areas. This concentration created new strategic considerations. Damage to cables, whether accidental or deliberate, could disrupt communication networks and energy systems simultaneously. The vulnerability of undersea infrastructure gradually entered public awareness through occasional incidents. Fishing vessels sometimes severed communication cables with heavy trawling equipment. Earthquakes triggered submarine landslides that snapped multiple lines at once. In 2006, a powerful earthquake near Taiwan damaged several fiber optic cables, disrupting internet services across parts of Asia for weeks. The event demonstrated how fragile the hidden network could be. Energy cables faced similar risks. Although they were heavily armored and carefully routed, they remained exposed to geological hazards and human activity on the seabed. Repairing them required specialized ships capable of locating the damaged section, lifting it from the ocean floor, and splicing in new cable segments. Depending on water depth and weather conditions, repairs could take considerable time. For regions heavily dependent on a small number of connections, this created potential vulnerabilities. Strategic analysts began describing submarine infrastructure as part of the critical backbone of modern society. Without it, electricity networks could fragment and digital communication could slow dramatically. These concerns intensified as geopolitical tensions returned.
By the late 2010s, the world had quietly crossed a threshold. The undersea grid was no longer a collection of experimental projects or regional power links. It had become a growing global system, stretching beneath seas and oceans with a complexity that few outside the energy industry fully understood. Every new submarine cable added another pathway through which electricity could move between countries. Every converter station created a new gateway connecting national grids to international energy markets. What had once been local infrastructure was becoming continental infrastructure. And wherever infrastructure expands, power structures begin to shift. Energy planners increasingly realized that the geography of the undersea grid would shape future economic influence. Countries located at strategic crossroads, where cables converged or where electricity flowed between regions, could gain enormous advantages. These locations became the energy equivalent of historic trade ports. Just as maritime cities once prospered by controlling shipping routes, modern energy hubs could prosper by controlling electricity routes. In Northern Europe, the transformation was already visible. The North Sea had become one of the most important energy regions in the world. Offshore wind farms stretched across the horizon in multiple countries. Beneath the water, thick armored cables carried electricity from turbine clusters toward offshore platforms and coastal converter stations. These installations were not isolated. Many were connected to international interconnectors, long HVDC lines linking national grids. The result was an increasingly integrated electricity system spanning multiple countries. During periods of strong wind, power surged from offshore farms into neighboring markets. When wind slowed, electricity could flow in the opposite direction through the same cables. The grid behaved almost like a living system, adjusting continuously to changes in weather, demand, and market prices. But while the system appeared cooperative on the surface, strategic calculations were never far away. Each government understood that grid connections created influence. A country capable of exporting large volumes of electricity during shortages elsewhere could shape regional energy markets. High demand would raise prices, generating economic returns for exporters. At the same time, import-dependent regions could become vulnerable if connections failed or if energy supplies tightened. These dynamics encouraged governments to think carefully about where cables landed and who controlled the infrastructure. Landing stations, the coastal facilities where submarine cables connected to national grids, became critical strategic assets. They housed transformers, switching systems, and monitoring equipment necessary for managing electricity flows. Control over these facilities meant control over how electricity entered or left the country. Some governments began quietly strengthening regulatory authority over cable projects within their territories. Foreign investors were welcomed, but oversight remained firmly in national hands. The lesson from earlier energy crises was clear. Infrastructure that supports national survival cannot be entirely left to external control. Meanwhile, offshore energy hubs grew larger and more complex. Instead of connecting just one wind farm to shore, engineers began designing platforms capable of linking multiple wind farms and multiple countries simultaneously. These hubs resembled floating electrical cities. Massive steel structures rose from the seabed, supporting transformers, switching equipment, and power electronics. Cables from dozens of turbines converged there before electricity traveled onward through HVDC transmission lines. Some hubs could send power to 2 or 3 different countries, depending on demand. This flexibility improved efficiency, but it also meant that operational decisions could affect multiple nations at once. Energy companies operating these platforms had to coordinate closely with grid operators across different jurisdictions. As the number of connections increased, the web beneath the ocean became increasingly intricate. In some areas, dozens of cables crossed the seabed within relatively narrow corridors. Engineers carefully mapped each route to avoid interference with existing infrastructure, such as pipelines, communication lines, and shipping channels. Despite these precautions, the sheer density of cables raised new concerns. If several lines in the same region were damaged simultaneously, whether by natural disaster or accident, the impact could spread across multiple energy systems. For example, a severe underwater landslide might sever several cables at once. If those cables connected different national grids, the disruption could ripple through international electricity markets. Grid operators therefore began developing more sophisticated contingency plans. Alternative routes were designed to carry electricity if primary links failed. Backup generation capacity was maintained to stabilize the system during emergencies. Yet even the most resilient systems cannot eliminate all risks. The growing importance of submarine infrastructure inevitably attracted the attention of security analysts and military planners. For centuries, naval strategy had focused on controlling surface sea lanes, shipping routes through which goods and fuel traveled. But in the 21st century, critical resources were increasingly moving beneath the water rather than across its surface. Electricity and information now flowed through cables hidden on the seabed. Protecting those cables became part of national security planning. Naval forces in several countries began investing in technologies capable of monitoring undersea infrastructure.
Autonomous underwater vehicles, remotely operated robots, and advanced sonar systems allowed operators to inspect cables at depths previously difficult to reach. These systems were designed primarily for maintenance and surveillance. Yet the existence of such capabilities also underscored the strategic value of submarine infrastructure. Anything important enough to protect is also important enough to threaten. At the same time, technological competition was intensifying in another area, cable manufacturing. Producing high-voltage submarine cables requires specialized factories capable of handling enormous lengths of insulated conductor material. The cables must withstand crushing ocean pressure, corrosion from salt water, and electrical stress over decades of operation. Only a limited number of companies around the world possess the expertise and facilities required to manufacture them. This concentration of industrial capability created another layer of geopolitical competition. Countries with strong cable manufacturing industries could influence global infrastructure projects. Their companies might supply cables for intercontinental energy links, renewable energy farms, or regional supergrids. In doing so, they would not only generate economic profit, but also shape the physical structure of the undersea grid. Governments recognized the strategic implications. Some nations began supporting domestic cable manufacturers through research funding and industrial policy. Maintaining technological leadership in HVDC systems became a priority. Meanwhile, demand for submarine cables was exploding. The global transition towards renewable energy required massive expansion of transmission networks. Offshore wind alone would require thousands of kilometers of new cables over the coming decades. At the same time, fiber optic communication cables continued multiplying to support the ever-growing data demands of the digital economy. Together, these industries were turning the seabed into one of the most heavily engineered environments on Earth. Yet most of the world remained unaware. To the average observer, the ocean still appeared vast and empty. But far below the waves, cables stretched like invisible highways connecting continents. And as the network expanded, another transformation began to emerge: energy trading. Electricity markets were evolving from local systems into cross-border marketplaces. Traders could buy electricity in one country and sell it in another within minutes using submarine interconnectors to transport the power. Prices fluctuated constantly based on supply, demand, weather patterns, and grid conditions. This created new economic opportunities. Companies specializing in energy trading began investing in advanced forecasting systems capable of predicting wind output, rainfall affecting hydropower reservoirs, and temperature-driven demand spikes. By anticipating these changes, traders could schedule electricity flows through submarine cables to profit from price differences between markets. While these activities improved overall efficiency, they also revealed the immense influence embedded in the grid. Control over transmission capacity, knowing when electricity could move and where, became financially valuable. Transmission rights were sometimes auctioned, with companies paying for the opportunity to move electricity across specific cables during certain time periods. The undersea grid was not only an engineering network, it had become an economic marketplace. And like any marketplace, it was shaped by power relationships. Countries hosting critical infrastructure could influence regulatory.
By the beginning of the 2020s, the undersea grid had reached a scale that few people outside specialized industries fully appreciated. Thousands of kilometers of submarine power cables connected islands to continents, linked national electricity systems, and carried energy from offshore wind farms to distant cities. What had started as isolated engineering projects decades earlier had quietly evolved into a vast and interconnected network beneath the oceans. Yet, with expansion came a new reality. The undersea grid was no longer purely economic infrastructure. It had become a strategic landscape. Governments,
Energy companies and technology firms all recognized that whoever shaped this network would influence the future structure of global energy. At the center of this transformation was the accelerating shift toward renewable electricity. Wind turbines were rising across coastal waters at a pace that would have seemed impossible only a decade earlier. In the North Sea alone, thousands of turbines formed enormous offshore energy fields. Similar projects were emerging off the coasts of Asia and North America. Each turbine produced electricity far from shore. To bring that electricity into national grids, submarine cables were essential. The sheer scale of these installations required something beyond traditional transmission design. Engineers began envisioning entire offshore grid systems that could collect power from multiple wind farms and distribute it across several countries simultaneously. These offshore grid platforms became some of the most sophisticated electrical installations ever built at sea. Massive steel structures stood on foundations driven deep into the seabed. Above the waves sat converter modules filled with advanced power electronics, capable of controlling gigawatts of electricity. Below the surface, bundles of thick armored cables radiated outward like the roots of an underwater tree. Some cables connected turbines to the hub. Others stretched hundreds of kilometers toward distant coastlines. These hubs created crossroads in the undersea grid. Electricity arriving from wind farms could be directed toward whichever country needed it most at a given moment. Grid operators across different nations coordinated constantly to manage these flows. Weather forecasts, demand projections, and market prices all influenced decisions about how electricity moved through the network. In effect, the sea itself had become a dynamic power marketplace. But while the technology represented remarkable cooperation, the geopolitical implications continued to grow. Control over offshore hubs meant influence over regional electricity distribution. If a country hosted key nodes in the network, it could become indispensable to neighboring energy systems. Even if power generation occurred elsewhere, the ability to route electricity through domestic infrastructure carried strategic value. This dynamic encouraged governments to compete for new cable connections. In Europe, for example, several countries began promoting themselves as future energy gateways. Their coastal regions offered favorable locations for landing stations, converter facilities, and grid control centers. Investors responded by proposing new interconnectors linking these countries to multiple partners. The more connections a nation hosted, the more central it became within the network. Yet the race for influence was not confined to Europe. Across Asia, rapid economic growth was pushing electricity demand to unprecedented levels. Governments explored ways to connect regional power systems through submarine cables, creating a web of energy exchanges across seas and island chains. Japan expanded its inter-island transmission links to improve grid stability. Southeast Asian countries discussed regional electricity trade through submarine interconnectors. Some proposals envisioned linking mainland grids with island states through long-distance HVDC cables. These ideas promised economic benefits, but also introduced strategic considerations. Energy networks create relationships that last for decades. Once built, submarine cables represent long-term commitments between nations. Countries considering such projects had to ask difficult questions. Would dependence on foreign electricity create vulnerability? Could political disagreements disrupt energy supply? Would shared infrastructure strengthen cooperation or amplify tensions? These questions had no simple answers. Nevertheless, investment continued. Energy transitions required massive transmission networks to connect renewable resources with urban demand centers. Without submarine cables, offshore wind farms and island grids could not reach their full potential. The technology had become indispensable. At the same time, another major development was reshaping the undersea infrastructure landscape. The digital economy was exploding.
Data traffic across the internet was increasing at extraordinary speed. Video streaming, cloud computing, artificial intelligence systems, and global financial networks all required enormous data capacity. Most of that capacity traveled through submarine fiber optic cables. Technology companies that operated large data platforms began investing directly in building their own cable routes between continents. These cables connected massive data centers in North America, Europe, and Asia, ensuring faster and more reliable communication between servers. Although these lines carried information rather than electricity, they often followed similar routes across the seabed. This meant that in many places, electrical cables and communication cables were layered together within the same undersea corridors. The result was a hidden infrastructure ecosystem. One layer carried electrical power, another layer carried digital information. Both were critical to the functioning of modern societies, and both shared the same physical environment beneath the oceans. As this ecosystem expanded, awareness of its vulnerability began spreading beyond technical circles. Accidents involving submarine cables occasionally disrupted services in dramatic ways. Fishing trawlers sometimes dragged heavy equipment across the seabed, damaging communication lines. Anchors dropped by large vessels could catch cables unexpectedly. Natural disasters also posed risks. Earthquakes could trigger submarine landslides that severed multiple cables at once. When such events occurred, repair operations were complex. Specialized ships had to locate the damaged section of cable, lift it from the seabed, splice new segments into place, and carefully lower the repaired line back into position. Depending on water depth and weather conditions, repairs could take weeks. During that time, electricity might need to be rerouted through other cables, and internet traffic might slow as data traveled through alternative routes. Most of the time, these disruptions were manageable, but as the undersea grid grew larger and more interconnected, the potential impact of failures increased. Security experts began describing submarine infrastructure as one of the most critical and least visible components of modern civilization. Without these cables, energy markets would fragment, and international communication would slow dramatically. This recognition began influencing strategic thinking in many governments. Naval forces started incorporating submarine infrastructure protection into maritime planning. Research programs focused on developing underwater drones capable of inspecting cables and detecting anomalies. These technologies served legitimate maintenance purposes, but they also highlighted a deeper truth. Infrastructure that can be inspected can also be interfered with. The possibility of deliberate sabotage, whether by state actors or non-state groups, became part of security discussions. These scenarios remained hypothetical in most cases, but the increasing strategic importance of submarine infrastructure meant they could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, technological innovation continued accelerating. Engineers developed new types of HVDC converters capable of handling higher voltages and greater power capacity. Modern cables could carry several gigawatts of electricity across hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. These improvements opened the door to entirely new categories of projects. For example, some planners began exploring the idea of transoceanic electricity transmission, long cables connecting continents directly. In theory, solar energy generated in desert regions could be transmitted across seas to distant population centers. Offshore wind farms located far from shore could supply power to multiple countries through shared transmission corridors. Although these projects remained expensive and technically challenging, the possibility itself demonstrated how far submarine power technology had advanced. Electricity was no longer confined by geography in the same way it had been for most of history. Energy could now travel beneath oceans, and where energy travels, influence follows. This realization gradually reshaped the strategic thinking of governments around the world. The undersea grid was not merely supporting globalization, it was becoming one of its defining structures. Countries that invested early in submarine cable technology, manufacturing, and infrastructure development could shape the network's architecture.
As the undersea grid expanded across the world's oceans, its role in global energy systems became impossible to ignore. Electricity was no longer confined to national borders or even to land. Beneath the seas, a growing network of submarine cables allowed energy to move between continents, between island nations, and between regions with very different natural resources. What had once been considered an engineering curiosity had matured into critical infrastructure. And wherever critical infrastructure exists, competition inevitably follows. By the early 2020s, governments were beginning to recognize that the structure of the undersea grid would shape the future of energy influence in much the same way that oil pipelines had shaped geopolitics during the 20th century. But submarine power cables introduced a new dimension. Oil and gas pipelines usually move fuel in one direction, from the source to the consumer. Electricity networks, however, are dynamic. Power can move in either direction, depending on demand, supply, and market conditions. This flexibility meant that undersea cables could create complex energy relationships between nations. Two countries connected by a cable might alternate between exporter and importer, depending on the time of day, weather conditions, or seasonal demand. Wind generation might surge in one region, while hydropower reservoirs filled in another. The network behaved like a living organism, constantly adjusting to balance supply and demand. Yet the strategic implications of this flexibility were significant. A country with multiple connections could act as a balancing center for surrounding grids. Electricity could flow through its infrastructure to reach other markets. In doing so, that country became a crucial intermediary. This role resembled that of historic trading hubs. Just as ports once thrived by facilitating trade between distant regions, energy hubs could thrive by facilitating electricity flows across the grid. Several nations began positioning themselves deliberately for this role. They invested heavily in new converter stations, expanded coastal transmission infrastructure, and encouraged international partners to connect through submarine cables. Over time, these investments began reshaping regional energy maps. In Europe, the North Sea was gradually evolving into the world's most interconnected offshore energy system. Countries around the sea were building a dense network of HVDC interconnectors linking their electricity markets. Wind farms, hydropower plants, nuclear stations, and solar installations all fed electricity into the shared system. But this cooperative vision was not the only force shaping the network. Economic competition played an equally important role. Electricity prices vary between regions depending on supply and demand. A country with excess generation can export power at profitable rates when neighboring markets experience shortages. Submarine cables made these exchanges possible within seconds. As a result, energy trading across borders became an increasingly sophisticated business. Companies developed advanced forecasting models that predicted wind speeds, rainfall patterns affecting hydropower, and temperature-driven demand spikes. By anticipating these changes, traders could schedule electricity flows through submarine cables to capture price differences between markets. While this improved overall efficiency, it also reinforced the strategic importance of transmission capacity. Control over transmission routes meant control over access to energy markets. Governments therefore took a growing interest in how new cables were financed and operated. Regulatory frameworks evolved to ensure that national interests were protected even as international cooperation expanded. Meanwhile, outside Europe, other regions were beginning to explore similar models. In East Asia, energy demand had grown so rapidly that governments started considering cross-border electricity networks on an unprecedented scale.
Some proposals envisioned linking mainland grids with island nations through long submarine cables. Others discussed connecting renewable energy projects in remote areas to distant cities through transnational transmission corridors. These ideas raised both excitement and concern. Supporters argued that interconnected grids could stabilize electricity supply while reducing reliance on fossil fuels. Renewable energy resources could be shared across wide regions, smoothing out fluctuations in wind and solar generation. But critics warned that such interdependence might create strategic vulnerabilities. If a nation relied heavily on electricity imported through submarine cables, it could face serious risks if those connections were disrupted. Energy independence had long been a central goal of national policy. The rise of interconnected grids forced policymakers to reconsider what independence meant in an era of shared infrastructure. The challenge was not only political, but also technological. Managing electricity flows across multiple countries required sophisticated coordination. Grid operators had to synchronize frequency levels, maintain voltage stability, and ensure that sudden disturbances did not cascade through interconnected systems. Modern control centers used advanced software capable of monitoring thousands of variables simultaneously. Real-time data from sensors along transmission lines helped operators anticipate potential problems before they escalated. Despite these tools, the complexity of the system continued growing. Each new cable added another pathway for electricity and another variable for grid managers to consider. Yet perhaps the most dramatic transformation was occurring offshore. As renewable energy projects moved farther from land, the scale of offshore infrastructure increased dramatically. Wind farms were no longer clusters of a few dozen turbines. Some projects involved hundreds of turbines spread across enormous maritime zones. These installations generated so much electricity that traditional point-to-point transmission lines were no longer sufficient. Instead, engineers began building offshore energy hubs capable of integrating multiple projects. These hubs served as collection points for electricity from surrounding wind farms. From there, high-capacity cables transmitted power toward different countries. Some hubs could deliver energy to several national grids simultaneously. This arrangement offered tremendous efficiency, but it also introduced new questions about governance. Who owned the hub? Which country regulated it? How were electricity flows prioritized when multiple markets demanded power at the same time? Negotiating answers required unprecedented levels of international cooperation. Energy ministries, regulatory agencies, and private companies worked together to develop frameworks governing offshore infrastructure. But even as cooperation expanded, strategic awareness continued growing. Infrastructure that spans multiple jurisdictions inevitably becomes politically sensitive. If an offshore hub supplies electricity to several countries, any disruption at that hub could affect millions of people. Security planners therefore began paying closer attention to the protection of submarine infrastructure. Naval forces expanded their ability to monitor seabed activity around critical cable routes. Research institutions developed autonomous underwater vehicles capable of inspecting infrastructure thousands of meters below the surface. Some countries established specialized units dedicated to safeguarding undersea assets. These efforts reflected a growing recognition that the seabed had become an important strategic domain. For centuries, nations had focused on controlling surface sea lanes. Warships protected shipping routes carrying oil, raw materials, and manufactured goods. But in the modern era, the most valuable cargo often travels beneath the water rather than above it. Electricity and information now flow through cables hidden on the ocean floor. The strategic significance of this infrastructure was becoming impossible to ignore. At the same time, technological innovation continued pushing boundaries. Engineers were experimenting with multi-terminal HVDC systems, networks where several converter stations connect to the same cable system, rather than relying on simple point-to-point links. These systems could allow electricity to flow between multiple countries through shared offshore grids. If successfully deployed at large scale, they would transform submarine cables from isolated connections into fully integrated networks. In other words, the undersea grid could evolve into something resembling a continental electrical web beneath the oceans. Such a system would dramatically increase flexibility and efficiency, but it would also amplify the strategic stakes. Who would control the nodes of this network? Which nations would become central hubs, and which ones would remain peripheral? The answers to these questions would influence energy security, economic competitiveness, and political relations for decades. By this point, it had become clear that the undersea grid was not just a technological project, it was an emerging arena of global influence. Countries were investing billions of dollars not only to meet energy demand, but also to position themselves strategically within the network. The cables beneath the oceans were beginning to shape the same kind of geopolitical patterns that pipelines and shipping lanes had shaped in earlier eras. And as the network expanded into deeper waters and more distant regions, new actors began entering the competition, bringing fresh ambitions and new strategies for controlling the
As the undersea grid expanded into the 2020s, a new phase of the story began to emerge. What had once been driven mainly by engineers and energy companies was increasingly shaped by governments pursuing long-term strategic goals. Electricity networks were becoming instruments of national influence. For decades, global energy geopolitics had focused largely on oil tankers, pipelines, and gas fields. Control over those resources defined alliances, trade relationships, and sometimes even wars. But as the world shifted toward electrification and renewable power, a different kind of infrastructure was rising in importance: submarine power cables. Unlike fossil fuels, renewable energy sources such as wind and solar power are widely distributed. Many regions can generate electricity from these resources. The challenge lies not in finding the energy, but in transmitting it efficiently to where it is needed. Undersea cables solved that problem for coastal and island regions. They also opened the possibility of something unprecedented: international electricity corridors stretching beneath seas and oceans. These corridors could link entire regions into shared power systems. Where such corridors formed, economic relationships followed. Electricity trade created new flows of revenue and new forms of dependency. Countries with surplus generation could export energy, while those with shortages could import power rather than building expensive backup plants. But the benefits of interconnection came with complex political implications. Who controlled the infrastructure? Who set the rules for electricity trade? And who ultimately decided how energy moved through the system? These questions became especially important as new actors entered the undersea cable industry. During the early years of submarine power development, most cable projects were concentrated in Europe and North America. A small group of engineering firms dominated cable manufacturing, installation, and grid technology. But as global demand for submarine cables surged, companies from additional regions began expanding into the market. This industrial competition added a new dimension to the undersea grid story. Countries capable of designing and manufacturing advanced HVDC systems could influence projects around the world. Their companies supplied cables, converter stations, and specialized installation equipment for international energy projects. In doing so, they shaped the physical architecture of the grid. Each cable laid across the seabed represented not only an engineering achievement, but also an industrial relationship between supplier and customer. These relationships sometimes lasted for decades. Once installed, submarine cables require maintenance, upgrades, and monitoring. Companies involved in construction often remain involved throughout the life of the project. This meant that technological leadership translated into long-term influence. Governments began recognizing the strategic value of maintaining strong domestic industries capable of producing submarine cables and related technologies.
Some countries expanded research programs aimed at improving HVDC efficiency and reliability. Others supported local manufacturing facilities capable of producing thousands of kilometers of cable annually. The demand justified the investment. Offshore wind power was growing at extraordinary speed. Each new wind farm required networks of submarine cables connecting turbines to offshore substations and then to land. Large projects often required hundreds of kilometers of cable. Multiply that by dozens of wind farms, and the scale becomes immense. At the same time, cross-border interconnectors continued expanding. Energy markets increasingly relied on electricity trade to stabilize supply. Submarine HVDC links allowed power to move between countries almost instantly. This flexibility became especially valuable as renewable generation increased. Wind and solar energy fluctuate with weather conditions. A cloudy day or calm winds can reduce generation quickly. Interconnected grids allow regions with surplus electricity to support areas experiencing shortages. Submarine cables, therefore, played a crucial role in maintaining reliability. Yet their growing importance also made them more visible to policymakers and security analysts. In previous decades, submarine cables had been treated mainly as technical infrastructure. Now they were recognized as part of national strategic systems. Protection of submarine infrastructure began appearing in defense planning documents. Naval forces expanded their ability to monitor activity near critical cable routes. Some countries deployed underwater surveillance systems capable of detecting disturbances on the seabed. These systems helped operators identify potential problems early, whether caused by natural events or accidental damage. But they also revealed something deeper. The seabed had become a contested space. For centuries, competition between nations had occurred mainly on land, in the air, and on the surface of the oceans. Now it was extending into the underwater environment, where critical infrastructure operated. Unlike naval fleets, submarine cables cannot move. Their routes are fixed once installed. This makes them both valuable and vulnerable. Protecting them requires careful monitoring and rapid repair capabilities. Repair operations themselves are complex undertakings. Specialized vessels must locate the damaged section of cable, retrieve it from the seabed, cut away the damaged portion, and splice new cable segments into place. In deep water, this process can take many days. Weather conditions often complicate the work. Storms can delay repair ships for extended periods. During that time, electricity flows must be rerouted through alternative connections. In most cases, the grid can adapt, but repeated disruptions could place stress on the system. These realities prompted grid operators to diversify their networks. Instead of relying on single cables, countries increasingly build multiple interconnectors, connecting the same regions through different routes. Redundancy improved resilience. If one connection failed, others could carry the load. This strategy also reflected the growing strategic awareness surrounding submarine infrastructure. Energy security in the modern era depended not only on power plants and fuel supplies, but also on the hidden cables linking grids across the oceans. Meanwhile, technological innovation continued pushing the boundaries of what submarine cables could accomplish. The newest HVDC systems could operate at higher voltages than earlier designs, allowing them to transmit larger amounts of electricity with lower losses. Some cables could carry enough power to supply several million homes. Engineers also developed new multi-terminal systems that allowed multiple converter stations to connect to the same cable network. Instead of simple point-to-point links, these systems could form branching networks capable of distributing electricity across several countries. In theory, such networks could eventually evolve into full offshore supergrids. These supergrids would integrate renewable energy generation across entire seas. Wind farms, tidal energy projects, and offshore solar platforms could all feed electricity into shared transmission systems. Power could then flow toward whichever region needed it most. For example, strong winds in one region might generate surplus electricity during nighttime hours. That power could travel through the offshore grid toward cities experiencing higher demand. Hydropower reservoirs in another region could act as storage systems, absorbing excess electricity and releasing it later when needed. The vision was ambitious. A fully developed offshore supergrid could transform the way energy moved across continents. But achieving that vision required enormous investment and unprecedented international cooperation. Countries would need to align technical standards, regulatory frameworks, and market rules. They would also need to trust one another with infrastructure that formed part of their national energy lifelines. Trust, however, can be fragile. As geopolitical tensions resurfaced in different parts of the world, policymakers began evaluating undersea infrastructure through a more cautious lens. Energy interdependence could strengthen alliances, but it could also create leverage points. Control over grid connections might influence negotiations on unrelated political issues. Although such scenarios remained largely theoretical, strategic planners preferred to anticipate risks rather than react to them after problems emerged. The undersea grid therefore became a subject of quiet strategic analysis. Governments studied which countries controlled key manufacturing technologies, which regions hosted important landing stations, and where future energy hubs might develop. The emerging map revealed a complex landscape. Some nations possessed enormous renewable energy resources but limited transmission infrastructure. Others had strong grid networks but fewer generation resources. Still others occupied geographically advantageous positions between major markets. Each factor influenced how countries approached submarine cable projects.
By the mid-2020s, the undersea grid had grown into one of the most complex infrastructure systems ever built by humanity. Thousands of kilometers of submarine power cables crossed seas and oceans, linking distant coastlines and connecting electricity markets that had once operated independently. Yet the deeper the network grew, the more visible its strategic importance became. Electricity was no longer simply generated and consumed within national borders. It flowed across regions through invisible corridors beneath the water, moving from areas of surplus to areas of demand within seconds. These corridors were the arteries of a new energy geography. For governments and energy planners, this reality created both opportunity and anxiety. Opportunity came from efficiency. Countries with strong renewable resources could export electricity rather than wasting excess generation. Markets could stabilize themselves through cross-border trading. But anxiety came from dependence. Every connection created a relationship. A cable linking two nations meant that each one relied partly on the other. If the connection carried large volumes of electricity, that relationship could become critical to economic stability. This dual nature of interconnection, cooperation combined with vulnerability, became a defining feature of the undersea grid. Energy ministers often spoke publicly about shared benefits and regional integration. Privately, however, governments also examined strategic risks. One question appeared repeatedly in policy discussions: who ultimately controls the grid? The answer was not simple. Unlike traditional power networks, which were usually owned and operated by national utilities, submarine interconnectors often involved complex partnerships. Energy companies, grid operators, financial investors, and multiple governments might all hold stakes in the same project. Ownership structures varied widely. Some cables were operated by joint ventures between neighboring countries. Others were owned by private transmission companies regulated by national authorities.
Still others were financed through multinational development agreements. This complexity made the system flexible but also difficult to govern. When electricity flows through several jurisdictions at once, decisions about maintenance, pricing, and access require constant negotiation. In most cases, these negotiations worked smoothly, but the larger the network became, the more complicated the relationships grew. Meanwhile, technological advances continued pushing the boundaries of submarine power transmission. New generations of HVDC cables were capable of operating at higher voltages and carrying more electricity than ever before. Some designs could transport several gigawatts of power across distances approaching 1,000 kilometers. To put that scale into perspective, a single cable could deliver enough electricity to power entire metropolitan regions. These capabilities encouraged energy planners to consider projects that would have seemed impossible only a decade earlier. One idea attracting increasing attention involved extremely long submarine cables connecting regions with vast renewable energy resources to distant population centers. For example, desert regions receiving intense sunlight could generate enormous quantities of solar electricity. Coastal cities thousands of kilometers away could import that electricity through HVDC transmission lines laid across seabeds. Similarly, remote offshore wind zones with powerful and consistent winds could supply electricity to multiple countries through shared undersea grids. These concepts suggested a future where electricity could travel across continents almost as easily as data travels across the internet. Yet such visions also raised questions about who would build and control these massive energy corridors. Large infrastructure projects require enormous capital investment. Governments and corporations must decide where to direct billions of dollars in funding. Those decisions inevitably reflect strategic priorities. A country that hosts the landing point for a major transcontinental cable might become a gateway for electricity entering an entire region. Converter stations built near that landing point could become critical nodes in the energy network. Control over such nodes can translate into economic and political influence. As a result, governments began competing to attract new cable projects to their shores. Coastal regions offered incentives, streamlined regulatory approvals, and invested in supporting infrastructure. The competition resembled earlier eras when nations competed to host major ports, rail junctions, or pipeline routes. But this time, the cargo moving through the network was electricity. Meanwhile, offshore energy systems were becoming larger and more sophisticated. Wind farms continued expanding farther from land, where stronger winds allowed turbines to generate more electricity. These projects sometimes covered hundreds of square kilometers. Within these vast energy zones, engineers constructed intricate cable networks linking turbines to offshore substations. From those substations, high-capacity export cables carried electricity toward national grids. In some areas, multiple wind farms shared the same offshore transmission infrastructure. This arrangement reduced costs and improved efficiency, but it also created shared dependencies. If a major export cable failed, several wind farms could lose their connection to land simultaneously. To reduce this risk, developers increasingly built redundant cable routes, allowing electricity to travel through alternative paths if necessary. The result was an expanding lattice of cables beneath the seabed. From above, the ocean still looked empty. But on detailed engineering maps, the seabed began to resemble a dense web of lines crossing between countries. Communication cables added another layer to this web. Fiber optic lines carrying global internet traffic often followed many of the same corridors as energy cables. Technology companies building new data connections often coordinated with energy infrastructure planners to avoid interference between routes. Together, these systems formed a dual network beneath the ocean floor. One layer moved electricity, the other moved information. Both were essential to the modern world, and both were largely invisible to the people who depended on them every day. This invisibility created a paradox. Modern societies rely heavily on undersea cables, yet most citizens rarely think about them. Electric lights turn on instantly. Internet videos stream smoothly. Financial transactions travel across continents in milliseconds. All of these functions depend partly on infrastructure lying thousands of meters beneath the water. Only when disruptions occur does the hidden network briefly enter public awareness. A damaged communication cable can slow internet connections across entire regions. A failed power interconnector can send electricity prices soaring or force grid operators to activate backup generation. These events serve as reminders of how interconnected modern infrastructure has become. Security experts therefore began emphasizing the need to protect submarine networks. Monitoring systems capable of detecting unusual activity near cable routes were gradually expanded. Some countries invested in underwater drones designed to inspect infrastructure in deep water. Cable operators improved coordination with maritime authorities to prevent accidental damage from fishing vessels or ship anchors. Despite these precautions, complete protection remained difficult. The oceans are vast, and submarine cables stretch across enormous distances. Repairing them is possible, but preventing every potential risk is far more challenging. This reality reinforced the importance of redundancy. Grid designers increasingly built multiple connections between regions so that electricity could be rerouted if one cable failed. Redundancy also provided economic benefits by increasing trading capacity between markets. Over time, the number of interconnectors linking major regions multiplied. Europe alone developed a dense web of submarine energy links connecting countries around the North Sea, Baltic Sea, and Mediterranean Sea. Other regions began following similar paths. Each new connection strengthened the global undersea grid. Yet as the network grew, so did the strategic stakes. Countries realized that their position within this system could influence their economic future. A nation located at the intersection of several major undersea cables might become a hub for energy trading and grid management. Another country might focus on exporting renewable electricity through long-distance transmission lines. Still others might concentrate on manufacturing the cables and equipment needed to build the network itself. These different strategies.
As the second decade of the 21st century unfolded, submarine power cables were no longer experimental infrastructure. They had become central components of national energy strategies. Governments were investing billions of dollars into interconnectors that stretched beneath seas and oceans, quietly transforming how electricity moved across the planet. Yet beneath the technical language of energy policy, a deeper transformation was underway. Electricity had begun to behave like a geopolitical resource. For most of modern history, nations competed over fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. These resources had to be mined, drilled, transported, and refined before they could produce power. Whoever controlled the fuel supply controlled the energy system. But electricity networks changed that equation. If power could travel long distances through submarine cables, then influence would depend less on the physical location of fuel deposits and more on the structure of the grid itself. In other words, whoever controlled the pathways of electricity could shape how energy flowed between regions. The idea sounded abstract at first, but real-world developments began to demonstrate its significance.
Across the North Sea, Europe's offshore wind expansion was reaching unprecedented scale. Wind farms were moving farther from shore, where stronger and more consistent winds produced more electricity. These massive installations required equally massive transmission systems. Instead of connecting each wind farm separately to land, engineers began designing integrated offshore grids. Large platforms in the sea would collect electricity from dozens of turbines. From these hubs, high-voltage cables would transmit power toward multiple countries at once. This architecture created something entirely new: energy crossroads located in open water. These offshore nodes could redirect electricity depending on where demand was highest. A strong wind in one area could supply cities hundreds of kilometers away. Energy planners described the concept as an offshore supergrid. Supporters argued that such systems could stabilize renewable energy supplies and reduce the need for backup fossil fuel plants. But the strategic implications were impossible to ignore. If an offshore hub connected several countries simultaneously, whoever controlled its operation could influence regional energy flows. Governments began negotiating complicated agreements governing ownership, regulation, and market access. Energy companies, transmission operators, and national regulators all sought a role in managing these new nodes. Behind the negotiations lay a simple reality: infrastructure creates power. At the same time, submarine cables were expanding in other parts of the world. In the Mediterranean, energy planners revisited proposals that had circulated for decades. North Africa possessed enormous solar energy potential. Vast deserts received sunlight year-round, making them ideal locations for solar power plants. Some policymakers envisioned exporting that energy northward to Europe through high-voltage cables laid beneath the Mediterranean Sea. The idea promised mutual benefits. Europe could supplement its renewable energy supply, while North African countries could gain new export revenues. Yet such projects raised complicated political questions. Energy infrastructure creates long-term dependencies. If a nation relies heavily on imported electricity through a submarine cable, its economic stability becomes linked to the political stability of the exporting country. Negotiators therefore had to balance economic opportunity with strategic caution. In the Middle East, similar ideas emerged. Countries around the Persian Gulf were exploring regional grid connections through submarine cables. Linking national grids could improve reliability during periods of peak demand and allow energy sharing between neighbors. Meanwhile, in Asia, the scale of ambition was even larger. Energy planners began discussing the possibility of a transcontinental electricity network stretching across large parts of Eurasia. Such a network could connect renewable energy resources in remote regions, such as wind-rich plains or sunny deserts, to major population centers thousands of kilometers away. Submarine cables would play a crucial role in linking island nations and crossing coastal seas. These ideas remained controversial. Building such networks would require enormous investment and deep political cooperation. Yet the fact that policymakers were even considering them showed how far the technology had progressed. Electricity could now move across oceans. And where energy could move, influence could follow. While governments debated these grand visions, another dimension of the undersea grid was quietly becoming more visible: vulnerability. Submarine infrastructure had always faced natural hazards. Earthquakes, underwater landslides, and powerful storms occasionally damaged cables. But as the number of cables increased, so did the consequences of failure. In highly interconnected grids, electrical flows dynamically between multiple regions. If a major connection suddenly disappears, the system must adjust instantly. Power plants ramp up or down, alternative routes carry additional load, and market prices fluctuate rapidly. Most of the time, these adjustments happen smoothly, but engineers know that electrical networks are complex systems. In extreme situations, disturbances can cascade through the grid, triggering widespread outages. Submarine interconnectors therefore required careful protection and monitoring. Operators installed sensors along critical routes to detect changes in temperature, pressure, or electrical performance. Surveillance systems monitored converter stations and coastal landing points. Naval forces in several countries began including submarine infrastructure in their maritime security planning. These precautions were not signs of imminent danger. Instead, they reflected a growing recognition that the undersea grid had become essential to modern life. Electricity now powered everything from hospitals and transportation systems to financial markets and digital communication networks. And the cables carrying that electricity across seas were part of the same fragile ecosystem. Meanwhile, technology continued evolving. The latest HVDC cables could transmit gigawatts of electricity, enough to power millions of homes across distances exceeding 1,000 kilometers. Advances in insulation materials allowed cables to operate at higher voltages, improving efficiency and reducing losses. Cable-laying ships also grew more capable. These specialized vessels resembled floating factories. Inside their hulls, enormous circular tanks stored hundreds of kilometers of cable, coiled in carefully arranged layers. During installation, the ship moved slowly along a predetermined route while the cable unspooled behind it, descending through the water column toward the seabed. Remotely operated vehicles followed the cable down, guiding it into position and sometimes burying it beneath sediment for protection. The operation required precise coordination between engineers, navigators, and oceanographers. Each project represented years of planning and enormous financial investment. Because of these costs, decisions about where to build cables were never purely technical. Governments evaluated economic benefits, energy security implications, and long-term strategic value. For example, a country that became a central hub in the undersea grid could attract investment from energy companies seeking reliable connections to neighboring markets. Such hubs might host converter stations, energy trading platforms, and maintenance facilities. Over time, these advantages could strengthen the nation's role in regional energy policy. The competition to become a hub was subtle but real. Coastal states evaluated potential landing points and offered incentives to attract infrastructure projects. Regulatory frameworks were adjusted to support cross-border electricity trade. Energy diplomacy became part of foreign policy discussions. At the same time, the relationship between energy cables and communication cables grew even more intertwined. Fiber optic networks continued expanding to meet the demand for cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and global data traffic. Technology companies invested heavily in new transoceanic routes linking data centers across continents. Although these communication cables
As the undersea grid continued expanding through the 2020s, a quiet realization began spreading among policymakers, engineers, and strategic analysts. The network beneath the oceans was no longer just supporting the global energy system, it was beginning to shape it. Electricity had become the central currency of the modern economy. Cities ran on it, transportation systems increasingly depended on it. Data centers that powered the digital world consumed enormous amounts of it.
The transition away from fossil fuels meant that even more sectors, cars, heating systems, and industrial processes were shifting toward electricity. That shift placed enormous pressure on power grids. Nations needed more electricity than ever before, and they needed it to come from increasingly diverse sources such as wind, solar, hydroelectric dams, and nuclear plants. These sources were often located far from the cities and factories that consumed their power. Submarine cables offered a solution. They allowed energy to travel from offshore wind zones to distant urban centers. They connected island grids to mainland systems. They created pathways through which countries could share renewable resources across seas. But as these connections multiplied, something deeper was happening. Electricity networks were becoming geopolitical networks. Each cable created a relationship between regions. Each converter station became a node in a growing system that crossed borders and oceans. And with every new connection, the structure of the network became more important. Network structure determines influence. If a country occupies a central position in the grid where multiple cables converge, it gains a degree of control over how electricity flows across the system. It can import power during shortages, export during surpluses, and serve as a gateway for energy movement between other nations. These positions are sometimes described as energy choke points. Unlike narrow straits used by ships, these choke points are electrical junctions where cables meet and power flows intersect. Control over such points can bring economic advantages and strategic leverage. For example, a country hosting several converter stations that connect different grids might become an essential transit hub for electricity trade. Utilities and energy traders would route power through that hub to reach surrounding markets. Over time, this activity could transform the host country into a regional energy marketplace. The analogy with historic trade hubs is striking. In earlier centuries, ports located along major shipping routes gained wealth and influence because merchants passed through them on their way to distant markets. In the age of the undersea grid, electricity hubs play a similar role, but instead of ships carrying goods, cables carry electrons. Meanwhile, technological innovation continued pushing the boundaries of submarine transmission. Engineers were experimenting with cables capable of operating at unprecedented voltages. Higher voltage allows electricity to travel longer distances with lower energy losses. Some new designs aim to transmit power across distances approaching 2,000 kilometers beneath the ocean. If successful, these technologies could enable transcontinental electrical links that were once considered impractical. Imagine solar farms in desert regions exporting electricity to distant cities through undersea transmission corridors. Imagine offshore wind farms in remote waters supplying power to multiple countries simultaneously. Such possibilities were beginning to appear on planning documents. Yet the realization of these visions depended on enormous infrastructure investments. Building a major submarine cable project could cost billions of dollars. Converter stations alone might require years of construction and extensive coordination between national regulators. Because of these costs, governments and corporations carefully evaluated each project's strategic value. Would the cable strengthen national energy security? Would it create new export opportunities? Would it position the country more favorably within the emerging global grid? These questions often influence decisions as much as engineering considerations. At the same time, new categories of investors entered the undersea infrastructure sector. Energy companies had long financed transmission projects, but now technology firms and financial institutions were becoming involved as well. The reason was simple: electricity and data had become intertwined. Modern data centers require enormous amounts of power to operate servers that store and process digital information. Many companies therefore built data facilities near major energy hubs or renewable generation sites.
Undersea cables, both energy and communication lines, often served the same regions. Where electricity flowed reliably, digital infrastructure tended to follow. This convergence created new ecosystems along certain coastlines. Regions hosting cable landing stations, converter facilities, and data centers began to attract investment from multiple industries. Ports, once used primarily for shipping, now supported high-tech energy infrastructure. Specialized maintenance ships, engineering firms, and monitoring centers appeared nearby. In effect, the undersea grid was reshaping coastal economies. Yet even as economic opportunities expanded, concerns about security continued growing. The hidden nature of submarine infrastructure made it difficult to monitor completely. Cables often lay thousands of meters below the ocean's surface, far beyond the reach of ordinary inspection. Though operators used sensors and underwater vehicles to monitor critical segments, large portions of the network remained physically remote. This raised questions about resilience. What would happen if multiple cables were damaged simultaneously? Could grid operators reroute electricity quickly enough to prevent widespread disruptions? In most cases, the system was designed with redundancy. Multiple interconnectors linked major regions, allowing electricity to flow through alternate paths if necessary. But extreme scenarios remained possible. For instance, a powerful undersea earthquake might trigger landslides that sever several cables at once. Severe storms could complicate repair efforts by preventing maintenance ships from reaching damaged areas. Such events were rare, but they demonstrated how dependent modern infrastructure had become on the seabed network. Energy security experts therefore emphasized the importance of diversification. Countries sought to balance domestic generation with international connections, ensuring that no single cable carried an overwhelming share of electricity imports. They also invested in backup generation capacity that could be activated if cross-border connections failed. Meanwhile, new monitoring technologies were being developed to improve cable protection. Autonomous underwater drones could patrol sections of the seabed and transmit high-resolution images back to control centers. Advanced sensors installed along cable routes could detect unusual vibrations or temperature changes, indicating potential problems. These tools allowed operators to respond quickly to emerging issues. However, technology alone could not eliminate every risk. The oceans remain vast and unpredictable environments. What governments could do was improve their ability to respond quickly when disruptions occurred. Repair fleets equipped with specialized cable lifting equipment were maintained in strategic ports. International cooperation agreements allowed operators to share resources during major repair operations. This collaboration reflected the reality that the undersea grid connected multiple nations. No single country could maintain the entire network alone. Yet cooperation did not eliminate competition. Even as countries worked together to maintain infrastructure, they continued competing for advantageous positions within the grid. Some invested heavily in renewable energy generation, aiming to become major electricity exporters. Others focused on building interconnection hubs where power from multiple sources could pass through their territory. A few concentrated on manufacturing the cables, converters, and installation vessels required to construct the network. These strategies reflected different visions of how power might develop in an electrified world. Would power belong primarily to those who generated energy, or to those who controlled the routes through which it traveled? The answer remained uncertain. What was clear was that the undersea grid had become one of the most important infrastructure systems on Earth. Its cables formed invisible highways carrying the electricity that powered modern civilization. And as the network expanded into deeper waters and longer distances, the strategic contest over who would shape its future architecture was becoming more intense.
By the late 2020s, the undersea grid had reached a level of complexity and scale that few people outside energy, engineering, and strategic circles fully appreciated.
Thousands of kilometers of submarine cables crisscrossed the oceans, connecting countries, islands, and entire regions. The world's electricity was moving faster and farther than ever before, flowing along invisible routes that shaped economic and political relationships in subtle but profound ways. What had started as a collection of engineering projects had quietly evolved into a global infrastructure network whose importance rivaled that of historic trade routes and strategic waterways. Electricity was no longer purely local. It had become a commodity that traveled internationally, controlled not only by generation capacity, but also by the placement of cables, converter stations, and offshore hubs. The strategic stakes became clearer with every major investment. Countries hosting critical nodes in the undersea grid gained influence not just over electricity, but over economic markets and even regional diplomacy. These nodes functioned as chokepoints. Controlling them allowed nations to influence the flow of power between regions. Decisions made at these points could ripple across multiple countries, affecting electricity prices, energy security, and industrial activity. In Europe, the North Sea and Baltic Sea became dense networks of offshore wind farms, interconnectors, and multi-country grid systems. Power no longer flowed in a simple linear pattern from a generator to a consumer. It flowed dynamically, responding to supply, demand, weather patterns, and market incentives. Electricity could be exported during periods of surplus and imported during shortages, creating interdependencies between nations that were both cooperative and competitive. Across Asia, the stakes were equally high. Rapid economic growth and massive urbanization created insatiable electricity demand, while renewable resources were often located far from population centers. Submarine interconnectors were proposed to link islands with mainlands, deserts with coastal cities, and offshore wind clusters with regional grids. The network began to form a patchwork of interdependencies that made energy both more flexible and more politically sensitive. The expansion of the undersea grid was accompanied by a growing awareness of vulnerabilities. Submarine cables, once taken for granted, were now recognized as critical strategic assets. Accidental damage, such as from ship anchors, fishing activity, or natural disasters, could disrupt electricity flows, while deliberate interference could create political leverage. Nations began investing heavily in monitoring and protection technologies. Autonomous underwater drones patrolled cable routes, and specialized ships and equipment stood ready to repair or replace damaged lines at sea. The industrial dimension of the undersea grid also intensified the strategic competition. Only a limited number of companies could manufacture the specialized high-voltage cables and advanced converter stations required for the network. Countries with strong industrial bases in these technologies could shape global infrastructure projects by supplying both equipment and expertise. This industrial leverage became a subtle but potent form of influence. Nations that controlled production could indirectly shape which regions connected to the grid and how efficiently electricity moved across it. The convergence of energy and digital infrastructure further amplified the stakes. Many submarine power cables shared corridors with fiber optic lines carrying global internet traffic. This co-location created dual dependency zones, regions where the flow of both electricity and information depended on the same infrastructure. Cities, ports, and industrial hubs near these zones became economic and technological magnets, while regions without access faced strategic disadvantages. As the network grew, policy and regulation became critical. Countries had to negotiate not only technical standards and market rules, but also questions of sovereignty and operational authority. Multi-country hubs and interconnectors required complex agreements on access, pricing, and maintenance. A failure to manage these relationships could create political friction or even economic disputes. At the same time, governments increasingly saw the undersea grid as a tool of influence.
Hosting landing stations or offshore hubs could provide a nation with both economic gain and geopolitical leverage. Exporting electricity, controlling flows, or providing access to neighbors all became mechanisms for strategic positioning. The network itself became an arena where economic, technological, and political power intersected. Technological innovation accelerated the pace of this contest. Multi-terminal HVDC systems allowed several converter stations to connect to a single cable network, creating flexible offshore grids that could serve multiple countries simultaneously. Ultra-high voltage cables enabled longer distance transmission with minimal loss. The potential to link continents, islands, and distant deserts directly through electricity lines became increasingly realistic. The stage was set for a new kind of global competition. No longer limited to traditional resources or shipping routes, power and influence now flowed through invisible currents beneath the ocean. Countries that anticipated the opportunities, controlled key nodes, and mastered the technologies would emerge as leaders. Those that lagged risked marginalization. The real tension, however, was not only technical or economic. The undersea grid was becoming a domain of subtle geopolitical maneuvering, where alliances, dependencies, and industrial capabilities could determine the balance of power for decades. What began as engineering ambition had evolved into a high-stakes global contest for control over the invisible arteries that carried the world's energy.
Part 12. By the end of the 2020s, the undersea grid had become a fully fledged arena of strategic competition. The network was no longer just a technical system for moving electricity. It had become a geopolitical instrument, an economic lever, and in many ways a tool of influence invisible to the public eye. Countries hosting critical nodes, offshore hubs, converter stations, and landing points began to realize that their position within the network could grant them disproportionate leverage over neighbors and trading partners. Just as controlling key straits or pipelines had once shaped global politics, controlling electricity corridors beneath the oceans could influence markets, diplomacy, and even military strategy. At the same time, the industrial competition for building and maintaining the grid intensified. Only a handful of companies worldwide possessed the technical capacity to manufacture ultra-high voltage submarine cables, design multi-terminal HVDC systems, and install massive offshore platforms. Governments that supported these companies effectively extended their influence over the global undersea network. Those nations with industrial dominance could determine which regions were connected first, how electricity flowed, and where technological innovations were deployed. This period also saw an unprecedented integration of energy and digital infrastructure. Many submarine cable corridors carried both electricity and fiber optic communication lines, linking power systems with data networks. The convergence of energy and information made some regions strategically indispensable. Cities and ports near these dual-use corridors became critical nodes of global commerce and governance, while regions outside the network risked marginalization. Redundancy and resilience became central themes in planning. Governments and grid operators invested heavily in multiple interconnectors, backup generation, and rapid response repair fleets. Autonomous underwater drones patrolled key routes, while international agreements ensured cooperation during emergencies. Yet these measures, while improving reliability, also highlighted the strategic value of each cable segment. Any disruption could reverberate across multiple countries' energy and digital systems. As the undersea grid grew, alliances and rivalries shifted. Countries with central positions in the grid coordinated to optimize trade and stabilize supply, while those seeking influence explored investments in generation, manufacturing, and landing stations to reposition themselves within the system.
The flow of electricity became both a tool of cooperation and a subtle instrument of power. The competition intensified further with the emergence of ultra-long-distance submarine projects. Engineers developed technologies capable of transmitting electricity across thousands of kilometers, linking renewable energy sources in remote regions to distant urban centers. Deserts and offshore wind farms could, in theory, power cities continents away. Nations with the capability to implement such projects gained enormous strategic advantage. The potential to control these transoceanic electricity flows added a new dimension to global energy politics. Meanwhile, the intersection of energy dependence and national security came sharply into focus. Policymakers recognized that countries reliant on imported electricity through undersea links could face vulnerabilities during crises, whether natural disasters, technical failures, or geopolitical disputes. Balancing interdependence with autonomy became a central concern for modern energy strategy. The stakes were no longer hypothetical. Energy and digital infrastructure had become intertwined with economic stability, technological leadership, and political influence. The undersea grid had emerged as an invisible but powerful force shaping the 21st century balance of power. Yet the most decisive phase of the undersea grid war was only beginning. As more nations and corporations vied for control over the next generation of cables, offshore hubs, and ultra-long-distance transmission routes, the invisible struggle beneath the oceans was poised to intensify, bringing both unprecedented opportunities and unprecedented risks.
As the 2030s approached, the undersea grid had evolved from a collection of engineering projects into a fully strategic domain. Electricity flowed beneath the oceans not only as energy, but as influence, shaping alliances, trade, and industrial dominance in ways few had anticipated. The stakes of the undersea network became increasingly clear during the deployment of ultra-long-distance submarine cables. These new links could transport gigawatts of renewable energy across thousands of kilometers, connecting distant deserts, offshore wind fields, and urban centers. Countries capable of hosting or controlling key segments of these projects suddenly found themselves in positions of significant leverage. Their infrastructure became the gateway through which vast regions accessed electricity, granting both economic and political influence. This power was invisible, yet its effects were tangible. Governments with central nodes could set access terms, influence electricity pricing, and determine the priority of energy flows in times of scarcity. Neighboring nations reliant on imported electricity became dependent on these chokepoints, creating subtle but potent leverage in international relations. The undersea grid had effectively become a strategic battlefield where influence was exerted not with armies, but with infrastructure. Industrial competition mirrored this geopolitical struggle. Only a few companies globally had mastered the manufacturing of high-capacity HVDC cables, multi-terminal converter stations, and installation vessels for deep-sea operations. Nations with industrial leadership effectively exported their influence worldwide, shaping which regions were connected, the technology deployed, and the efficiency of energy delivery. Investment in domestic manufacturing and research became a strategic imperative, as industrial capability equated to global leverage in the electrified era. Energy and digital infrastructure increasingly overlapped. Fiber optic communication lines often followed the same routes as power cables, linking the flow of electricity with global data networks. Regions that hosted dual-use corridors became technological and economic hubs, attracting investment in energy trading, data centers, and industrial development. Conversely, areas outside the network risked isolation from both critical electricity flows and global information systems. Redundancy and security were paramount.
Grid operators designed multiple interconnectors, backup generation systems, and rapid response repair fleets to prevent single points of failure. Autonomous underwater drones monitored cable routes, while international agreements enabled cooperation in emergencies. Even with these precautions, the vastness of the oceans and the immobility of cables made vulnerability unavoidable. The potential for natural disasters, accidents, or deliberate interference meant that resilience was not optional, it was a strategic necessity. Political and economic competition intensified as nations pursued different strategies within the grid. Some focused on generating surplus renewable electricity for export, others on hosting converter hubs to centralize flows, and a few on controlling the industrial supply chain for cables and installation. Each strategy carried long-term implications for influence and economic advantage. The convergence of these factors created an entirely new form of global contest. Unlike traditional geopolitical struggles over territory, oil, or shipping lanes, this conflict played out in invisible currents beneath the seas. Power, both literal and figurative, flowed through the same arteries. Nations that anticipated technological breakthroughs, invested in critical infrastructure, and positioned themselves strategically within the network could gain decades of advantage. Those that lagged risked dependency and marginalization. By the end of this period, the undersea grid had become more than a network of cables. It was a central element of 21st century global power. Economic prosperity, technological leadership, and political influence were all intertwined with the invisible currents beneath the oceans. The final chapter of this story reveals how the global undersea grid reshapes continental influence, determines strategic hierarchies, and sets the stage for future conflicts and collaborations in the electrified world.
By the mid-2030s, the undersea grid had transformed into one of the most consequential infrastructures in human history. What began as a series of technical experiments, cables linking islands, offshore wind farms, and neighboring countries, had grown into a global lattice of electricity and information, stretching across continents and beneath oceans. The network now dictated not just how energy moved, but how influence, power, and opportunity were distributed across the world. At the heart of the culmination was the recognition that control over the undersea grid equaled strategic leverage. Nations with central nodes, major converter stations, offshore hubs, or critical cable crossings could influence the flow of electricity to entire regions. These choke points became instruments of economic power. Pricing, access, and even the prioritization of energy flows could be subtly adjusted to favor certain allies or create pressure on competitors. The final phase of the undersea grid war was not fought with conventional weapons, but through infrastructure, technology, and industrial dominance. Industrial capacity became a strategic asset. Countries capable of manufacturing ultra-high voltage cables, multi-terminal HVDC systems, and the specialized ships needed for installation and repair effectively exported their influence across the oceans. The placement of infrastructure, the choice of partners, and the technology deployed became tools of soft power, shaping regional and global energy dependency for decades. Simultaneously, energy and digital flows converged in ways that magnified stakes. Many of the same submarine corridors carried fiber optic cables connecting not just electricity, but the entire digital ecosystem. Data centers, financial networks, and communications relied on the same paths as energy. Regions that controlled these dual-use corridors became economic and technological hubs, while those without access risked marginalization in both energy and information systems. Redundancy and resilience were crucial in this final phase. Multi-cable interconnectors, backup generation, and rapid response repair fleets ensured that disruptions were minimized. Autonomous underwater drones monitored critical routes, and international cooperation agreements allowed nations to respond quickly to accidents or attacks.
Yet, despite these measures, the vulnerability of fixed seabed infrastructure remained an enduring reality. Even minor disruptions could reverberate through markets, industries, and governments, underscoring the strategic weight of every cable and node. As the network matured, global strategies became increasingly sophisticated. Some nations pursued massive renewable generation for export, turning energy abundance into a source of influence. Others prioritized hosting central hubs, serving as gateways for electricity flows across entire regions. A few focused on technological leadership, controlling the manufacturing and installation of infrastructure itself, effectively shaping the global network according to their strategic vision. By this stage, the undersea grid was fully intertwined with geopolitical considerations. Alliances were informed by infrastructure connectivity, industrial capacity, and energy dependence. Nations that anticipated technological breakthroughs positioned themselves at critical nodes and invested in the expansion of the network, gained disproportionate influence over global energy flows. Countries that lagged found themselves increasingly dependent, often at the mercy of others' infrastructure decisions. The culmination of the undersea grid war revealed a subtle but profound truth. Modern influence no longer relied solely on territory or military strength. It depended on the invisible electrified arteries beneath the oceans that connected continents, powered cities, and carried information. Control over these currents determined who could move energy efficiently, who could stabilize markets, and who could assert strategic leverage in a highly interconnected world. In the end, the undersea grid reshaped global hierarchies, created new forms of cooperation, and exposed vulnerabilities invisible to the public eye. Electricity and information flowed through its veins, silently defining the balance of power for the 21st century. The era of the undersea grid war closed not with dramatic explosions or battles, but with a quiet, pervasive restructuring of influence, where the currents beneath the waves dictated the contours of modern civilization. The story of the undersea grid war concludes here, leaving the oceans transformed into a hidden but decisive stage for global power, influence, and strategic foresight.